It was the kind of desert that seemed endless, its golden sands stretching out in all directions. Most people would never venture into such isolation, but for a group of 5 friends eager to experience the ultimate thrill, it was an adventure they would never forget, though not in the way they had imagined. It started with a simple plan, a weekend trek through one of the most remote desert areas known for its eerie quietness. The group, Jake, Sarah, Matt, Olivia, and Ben, had all done their research. They knew the terrain, the risks, and had even hired a guide. But something about the desert felt wrong from the very first step. The guide, an experienced desert explorer named Khalid, seemed off from the moment they met him. He spoke little, only giving brief instructions as they set off. It wasn't long before the desert's vastness enveloped them, the heat almost unbearable, the silence suffocating. By midday, Matt, the most adventurous of the group, had wandered ahead, pushing through the soft sand with a sense of urgency. "Catch up, guys," he shouted, but the others, exhausted and drenched in sweat, could barely keep pace. That's when it happened. Matt screamed. A shrill, high-pitched sound that echoed in the silent wasteland. The others froze. Sarah and Olivia looked at each other, eyes wide with fear. Ben, being the brave one, rushed forward toward the sound. Khalid, however, didn't move. "Don't go," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You must never follow the scream." Ignoring him, Ben ran faster, his heart pounding in his chest. He found Matt just a few yards ahead, his body collapsed against a large, weathered rock. But it wasn't the sight of Matt that disturbed Ben. It was the way his friend's face was frozen in terror, his eyes wide open as if he had seen something beyond this world. Matt's lips moved slowly, but no sound came out. He was trying to speak, but it was as if his voice had been stolen by the desert itself. Ben knelt beside him, shaking him, trying to snap him out of the trance. It didn't work. The air grew thicker, almost suffocating, and Ben felt a coldness seeping into his bones, even in the heat. With a final, desperate push, Ben managed to lift Matt to his feet. But something was wrong. Matt wasn't walking on his own anymore. It was as if he was being dragged, his feet barely touching the ground. Suddenly the ground beneath them trembled. A low rumble reverberated through the sand. And then silence. The desert, once so unnervingly quiet, was now alive with an energy they couldn't explain. The sand shifted, as if something was moving beneath them. A cold gust of wind swept through, carrying with it the faintest whisper. No, a voice. Ben didn't hear the voice clearly, but he felt it. It was calling out to them. It was hungry. The oppressive silence of the desert had swallowed them whole. Ben, Matt, and the rest of the group stood frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Khalid, the guide, had insisted they return to camp immediately, but the desert's vastness and the unknown forces at play made them feel like they were walking in circles. The nightfall came quickly. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand. As darkness overtook the landscape, the cold of the desert night seeped into their bones. They had no choice but to make camp, but the uneasy feeling in the pit of their stomachs told them this would be a night unlike any other. Ben and Sarah set up the tent, while Matt and Olivia sat nearby, trying to comfort the still, silent Matt. Khalid, however, sat apart from the group, staring off into the distance with a look of deep worry in his eyes. "Why didn't you tell us?" Ben finally asked Khalid, breaking the eerie silence. "You knew something was wrong." Khalid's eyes flickered towards Ben, his face pale. "The desert does things to people," he muttered, barely audible over the wind. "It speaks to them, whispers to them. Once you hear it, it's already too late. I tried to warn you." Ben's blood ran cold at Khalid's words. It had been too late for Matt already, and it felt like they were all being drawn into something they couldn't escape. The wind howled across the desert, kicking up sand in swirling gusts that seemed to come from nowhere. "What did Matt hear?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What happened to him?" Khalid's eyes darkened. "The desert is cursed. It's been like this for centuries. People who wander too far get lost. They hear voices, whispers. They see things, terrible things. It's not just the heat and isolation that breaks them. It's the desert itself. It gets inside your mind." The others exchanged worried glances, trying to process his words, but none of them dared to ask more. What if they were already too deep into this nightmare? Night settled in like a blanket of dread, and as they huddled inside the small tent, they could hear the desert breathing around them. The wind screamed like a dying animal, rattling the canvas walls. They barely slept, each of them too fearful to close their eyes, haunted by the sense of being watched. Around midnight, it happened. Matt, the one who had been so silent, suddenly stirred. His eyes snapped open, wide and unblinking. His body jerked upright, as if pulled by invisible strings. The others watched in horror as he began muttering to himself, his words barely recognizable, like a foreign language. "No, no, no!" Matt's voice was cracked and broken. "It's here! It's coming!" Ben and Sarah tried to calm him down, but it was no use. Matt's hands began clawing at his own face, as if trying to tear something off. Olivia screamed in terror as Matt's eyes rolled back into his head, his body convulsing violently. Then just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Matt slumped forward, motionless. The silence that followed was suffocating. Khalid stood at the entrance of the tent, his face drained of color. "The desert doesn't give up its secrets easily," he whispered. "And it doesn't let anyone go. Once you're marked, you're trapped forever." "What do you mean, marked?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. Khalid's eyes were filled with sorrow. "The desert has a way of claiming its own. Once you hear its call, you're bound to it. The spirits of those who wander into the desert without ever returning, they stay here, their souls lost to the sands, and they call out to the living. They find ways to reach inside your mind, to drag you into the endless night." The group was paralyzed with fear, but they knew they had no choice but to keep moving. They had to find help, or at least get out of the desert. Khalid suggested they try to find the nearest village, but even he wasn't sure where it was. The desert had a way of distorting reality, making landmarks vanish, and distances seem longer than they actually were. As dawn broke, they packed up their things and started walking again, with Matt now barely able to stand on his own. His eyes were glassy, and his expression was vacant. It was as if whatever had taken hold of him had left him a shell of the person he once was. They walked for hours, but the desert remained unchanged. It stretched out before them, an endless sea of sand and rocks, as if mocking their every step. The air was thick with heat, and every direction looked the same. Ben was the first to notice something was wrong. They had been walking for hours, but they hadn't passed any landmarks. No rocks, no unusual formations, not a single sign that they were getting closer to anything. It felt as though the desert was swallowing them whole. "Khalid," Ben said, his voice tight with panic. "We've been walking in circles. This isn't right. We should have seen something by now. We're not going anywhere." Khalid's face had gone ashen. He turned slowly to look at the group, and for the first time, Ben saw genuine fear in his eyes. "The desert. It's changing," Khalid whispered, almost to himself. "It's not just the heat. We're trapped. It doesn't want us to leave." Ben's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? We can't be—" A sudden wind whipped through the desert, cutting off his words. The sand shifted and swirled, and in the distance, someone appeared. It was a figure, cloaked in rags, standing just beyond the reach of their vision. At first, they thought it was a mirage, an illusion brought on by the heat. But then it moved. The figure was walking toward them, slowly but deliberately. It was human, at least it looked human, but something was wrong. Its movements were jerky, unnatural. Its face was hidden by a tattered cloth, but the air around it seemed to shimmer with an unsettling energy. Ben's stomach twisted into knots as he watched the figure approach. They stood frozen, unable to move, their hearts racing in terror. The figure stopped just in front of them, and as it raised its head, the wind died down completely. The face beneath the cloth was gaunt and hollow, as though all the life had been drained from it. Its eyes were empty, black voids, and when it spoke, its voice was nothing more than a whisper on the wind. "You should have listened," it said, the voice sounding both distant and close at the same time. "Now you belong to the desert." The figure in front of them remained motionless, its hollow eyes locked onto each of them, as if it was judging their very souls. Ben felt his legs tremble beneath him, but he couldn't tear his gaze away. It was as if the figure was pulling him into its gaze, slowly suffocating him with a sense of overwhelming dread. "You should have listened," the figure repeated, its voice now a low, guttural whisper that seemed to echo inside their minds, resonating with an unnatural resonance. The wind began to stir once more, but it was colder now, unnervingly cold for a desert that had just hours ago been sweltering in heat. Sarah, her face pale, took a trembling step back, her voice barely audible. Who are you?" The figure's head tilted, its movement sharp and unnerving, as if every joint was stiff and unnatural. "We are the ones who never left. We are the souls of the lost. We are the desert." The words felt like they were crawling under their skin, each syllable like a heavy weight pressing down on their hearts. The air seemed to grow denser, suffocating, as if the very desert itself was closing in on them. The figure reached up slowly, pulling the cloth from its face. What lay beneath was worse than anything they could have imagined. Its face was not human. It was an abomination. The skin was stretched too tight over its skull, cracked and peeling in places. Its eyes, black and void, seemed to absorb the very light around them, swirling like endless pits of darkness. Its lips were thin, cracked, and twisted into a grotesque, toothless grin that stretched unnaturally across its face. Olivia screamed, taking a step back, but her feet sank into the sand, as if the ground itself had turned to quicksand. "No!" she cried, struggling to pull her foot free, but it was no use. The more she struggled, the faster the sand consumed her, pulling her down inch by inch. Ben rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he tried to pull her out of the sand. But it was too late. Sinking, her eyes wide with terror as she screamed for help. The sand continued to swallow her whole, and just as her head disappeared beneath the surface, she gasped, "It's too late for us. We're trapped." Ben's heart hammered in his chest, and a cold wave of realization washed over him. They weren't just lost in the desert. They were being hunted, trapped by the very forces that had claimed those who came before them. The figure tilted its head again, its twisted grin growing wider, showing jagged, razor-sharp teeth that seemed to stretch out from its gums like something out of a nightmare. It was laughing, but the sound was distorted, a mixture of human and animalistic joy that sent chills down Ben's spine. "You are not meant to leave," the figure whispered, its voice now a chorus of tortured souls. "You will be one of us forever." Ben's heart raced, his thoughts a blur. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her away from the encroaching figure, but the desert around them seemed to shift, the once familiar landscape becoming foreign, disorienting. No matter which direction they turned, the sand stretched on, an endless ocean of nothingness. "We have to get out of here," Sarah shouted, but her voice was lost in the wind. "We have to find a way out." Ben looked around frantically, his eyes darting to Khalid, who had been strangely silent since the figure's appearance. Khalid stood apart from them, his eyes vacant, staring into the distance. The terror that had once been in his face was now replaced by a resigned, empty expression, as if he had already given up. "Don't waste your time," Khalid muttered, barely audible. "There is no escape. The desert has claimed you." "Don't say that," Ben shouted, his voice rising in panic. "We can make it out. We just need to keep moving." Khalid's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You don't understand," he said in a hollow voice, stepping closer to Ben and Sarah. "It's not just the sand or the heat or the wind. It's the desert itself. It's a living thing, hungry and relentless. Once it decides it wants you, there's no escape. It feeds on your fear, your regret, your darkest thoughts. It turns your mind against you, twists your memories until you can't tell what's real anymore." Ben felt a shiver run down his spine. Khalid's words hit him like a cold slap, but they made too much sense. The sense of isolation, the whispers in the wind, the strange figure that had appeared out of nowhere, it was all starting to come together. This can't be real," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We're dreaming. This can't be happening." But it was happening. They could feel it in their bones. The very desert was alive, and it was coming for them. Suddenly, Ben's vision blurred, his mind spinning. The ground beneath him seemed to tilt, and he stumbled, falling to his knees. The desert stretched out before him, but the landscape had changed. The sky was now dark, streaked with eerie, unnatural clouds, and the sand beneath his hands felt like cold stone. "No!" he gasped, his breath shallow. "What's happening?" The figure was back, but it wasn't alone. Hundreds, no, thousands of figures emerged from the sand, their twisted faces grinning, their eyes black voids. They circled around him and Sarah, moving slowly, deliberately. Each figure whispered in unison, their voices blending together into a haunting chorus. "You cannot escape. You are already ours. You will join us." Ben tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. His body felt heavy, his mind clouded by fear. Sarah gripped his arm, but her fingers were cold, her touch weak. It was as if she was fading away, as if the desert was swallowing her piece by piece. "No!" Ben screamed, shaking her. "Sarah, stay with me! We can fight this! We can survive!" But the desert was already pulling them under. The sand rose around them, slowly suffocating them. Ben could feel the ground shifting beneath him, as if the desert itself was trying to swallow him whole. And then everything went black. Part 4. The Final Revelation. When Ben opened his eyes, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. He could feel the weight of the desert pressing down on him, but he was no longer surrounded by the eerie figures. The wind had stopped. The air was thick with silence, and the sun, now high in the sky, cast harsh light across the endless sea of sand. But there was something different. Something had changed. He was alone. The others, Matt, Olivia, Sarah, and even Khalid, were nowhere to be seen. The desert had swallowed them whole, just as it had threatened to do. It was as if they had never existed. Ben's heart raced. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. His mind spun with confusion, but one thought pierced through the fog. The desert had claimed them all. And then he heard it, the faintest whisper carried by the wind. "Join us!" Ben's stomach turned as he turned around. Standing behind him, the figure was there once more, its twisted face grinning. It was too late. Ben's mind raced as he tried to understand what had happened, his pulse pounding in his ears. The figure in front of him, those hollow eyes, the twisted grin, had to be a mirage. He had to be hallucinating. There was no other explanation. "Stay away," he whispered hoarsely, his throat dry, his voice barely a rasp. But the figure took a step forward, its movements unnatural and fluid, like it was one with the desert itself. Its feet sank into the sand with a sickening squelch, and Ben's heart began to pound faster. "Stay away!" he shouted this time, his voice cracking as panic surged through him. He scrambled backward, kicking up sand beneath him as he fought to stand, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The figure didn't answer, only advanced. Its presence seemed to draw the very light out of the air, making the desert feel even colder than it already was. The heat of the sun above had no effect now. The air felt frigid, suffocating in its stillness. Ben backed into a large rock formation, his eyes darting desperately for an escape, but the landscape remained unchanged. The endless sea of sand stretched out before him, an unforgiving wasteland that seemed to swallow up any hope. There was nowhere to go. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I don't want to join you. I want to live." The figure's twisted grin grew wider. "It's too late for that. You're already part of us. You always have been." Ben felt a cold chill in his spine as the words reverberated in his chest. He was frozen, unable to move as the figure's presence grew closer. Every step it took made the ground tremble slightly, a deep, resonating vibration that made his bones ache. The figure stopped a few feet away from him, tilting its head to the side in a way that was far too unnatural for something human. The desert remembers. It remembers all those who have wandered into its depths, all those who have disappeared without a trace. Their souls remain trapped here, their screams lost in the wind. Ben felt his throat tighten, his breath coming in short gasps as fear consumed him. The air seemed to grow thicker, as if the desert itself was trying to choke him. "Where are they?" he asked weakly, his voice trembling. "The others. My friends." The figure's grin stretched even further, impossibly wide. "They are here, just like you will be. Their bodies lost to the sand, their memories twisted by the desert's hunger. They are all a part of it now." Ben tried to hold it together, but the terror clawed at him. He knew that the desert had claimed them all. Olivia, Sarah, Khalid, all of them were gone. And now it was his turn. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. I won't let it happen." But as he looked around him, the world seemed to shift. The landscape was no longer the dry, barren wasteland it had been. The sand was now blackened, cracked, and cold, like the remnants of a long-dead fire. The sky was no longer the bright blue it had once been, now a swirling mass of grey clouds that seemed to move of their own accord. And in the distance, Ben could make out the faint shapes of figures, hundreds of them, emerging from the sand. The figures were silent, their bodies twisted, their faces hollow, as if they were caught between life and death, their spirits bound to the desert forever. Ben felt his legs give way beneath him. He collapsed onto the sand, his body heavy, his head spinning. The heat was gone, but the suffocating darkness of the desert was all around him. The figure leaned closer, its voice low and almost soothing now. "You'll soon forget. All of you forget. The desert takes what it needs, and in time you will become a part of it, a memory to be forgotten by the world. The winds will carry your voice, your cries, but no one will hear." Ben closed his eyes, hoping against hope that he could wake up, that this nightmare would end. But it didn't. It never did. his hands clenched into fists, his breath ragged as the cold sand surrounded him. It felt like he was sinking into the earth itself. The voices, those voices of the lost, echoed in his mind, growing louder, surrounding him, drowning him in their sorrow. In the distance, the darkened silhouettes of the figures continued to move toward him, each one drawn to his fear like a moth to a flame. Suddenly, Ben felt a rush of wind, sharp and icy, cutting across his face. It wasn't like any desert wind he had ever felt. It was a wind of sorrow, a wind that carried with it the weight of the souls who had perished here. The figure seemed to stand taller now, its form growing more monstrous as the wind swirled around it. The desert had begun to close in on him, trapping him in its grip. "No!" Ben gasped, his heart racing. "Please!" But the figure reached out, its long skeletal hand hovering inches from his face. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the air around him thickened with an oppressive force. The shadows deepened, pulling him into a void where nothing could escape. "You belong to us now?" the figure said, its voice not a whisper, but a booming, resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The desert's hunger will never be satisfied. It is endless, and so are we." Ben could feel his strength draining away. His eyelids felt heavy, and the weight of the desert's power seemed to press down on him from all sides. He felt his mind begin to unravel, his sense of reality slipping away. It was no use, he had become a part of it. As the wind howled louder, he could hear the whispers of the other souls, their voices blending with the desert's song. There was no escape now. Ben had become another lost wanderer, his name and his story just one more forgotten memory in the sand. Ben's body was heavy, suffocating in the grip of the desert's power. The winds were no longer a breeze, but a violent storm that tugged at him, pulling him deeper into the earth's endless, hungry maw. The eerie figures from before had surrounded him now, their faces blank slates of despair, their hollow eyes fixed on him, as if waiting for him to accept the truth of his fate. He could no longer distinguish the line between sleep and wakefulness. His body felt numb, yet the tension in the air was palpable. It was like the desert was watching him, studying his every move, drawing him in with the promise of oblivion. In the distance, through the haze of the swirling sandstorm, Ben could barely make out the shape of a figure moving toward him. It was tall, imposing, and as it drew closer, he could feel a sense of dread gnawing at him, like an instinct deep within that told him this figure was not like the others. The wind howled again, louder this time, and Ben could hear voices, so many voices whispering from the darkness. The whispers were soft at first, but then they grew louder, more insistent, as if the very desert itself was trying to communicate with him. He tried to move, tried to scream, but no sound came. His lips were sealed shut, and his body remained frozen, anchored by the invisible force that held him in place. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving with the effort to escape the overwhelming pressure. The figure that approached him grew clearer. It wasn't just another soul of the desert, it was something else. Its face was pale, and its eyes, though black like the others, held something far darker. A deep emptiness, an ancient power that Ben could not comprehend. The figure stopped in front of him, towering over him. It was taller than any human, its limbs twisted and elongated, like they had been stretched and pulled beyond recognition. Its voice was deep, reverberating through the sand around them. "You cannot escape," it said, its tone heavy with finality. "No one does. You have come to the heart of the desert, and the heart of the desert never lets go." Ben tried again to speak, but his throat was dry, parched from the wind and the desert's cruel touch. His limbs felt like lead, and the weight of the sand in the air seemed to press against him, suffocating him further. "Why?" he managed to rasp. "Why is this happening? What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, almost curiously. "It is not about what we want," it replied. "It is about what you have become. You are part of the desert now, as much as anyone who has ever walked this land and been lost to it." Ben's vision began to blur. The desert was overwhelming him. He was becoming one with it, slowly losing his sense of self, his sense of time. The sand, the figures, the voices, they were all merging into a single entity. The boundaries between the living and the dead, the real and the imagined, were no longer clear. "The desert takes what it needs," the figure continued, its voice now cold and detached. "It needs those who wander too far, those who lose their way. It devours them, and in return they become part of its endless hunger." Ben felt his knees buckle beneath him, the ground seemingly swallowing him whole. The pressure in his chest intensified, and for a moment he thought he might suffocate entirely. His body refused to obey him, and he could feel himself sinking into the sand, like it was pulling him into its depths. "No," he gasped. "I don't want this. I'm not like them. I'm not like the others." But his words were swallowed by the storm of sand, and the figure merely watched him, its eyes void of empathy, as if it had seen this play out 1,000 times before. Ben's mind flashed back to the beginning of their journey, the excitement, the curiosity, the thrill of exploring the unknown. And now, here he was, trapped, his soul bound to the very desert he had once admired. "Escape is an illusion," the figure said softly. "There is no running from the desert's embrace. We are all part of it. We always have been." Ben's mind reeled as the reality of those words sank in. He was losing himself. The desert had already claimed him. The storm intensified around him, the sound of its howling winds deafening in his ears. His body was no longer his own, and the figures around him closed in, silent and unfeeling. As the last remnants of his consciousness began to fade, Ben realized there was no escape. The desert had taken him, and he would never leave. The winds howled one final time, and with it, his cries were drowned.